when it comes to Xcoal energy, you've been reducing your business in China over the last few years. What are you really expecting as far as the India-US trade partnership goes? There is conversation about having a limited trade deal. There was a conversation in Trump 1.0 as well, but it did not happen. But what would be good for US energy companies this time around?
Thank you. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the energy trade between the U.S. and India to grow. The U.S. one of the largest exporters of energy in the world in the form of LNG, the largest exporter of coal, and an exporter of the technology that allows you to consume those products in an environmentally sustainable fashion. So we had I would say, a very good momentum of increasing energy trade during the first Trump administration. The last 4 years, the U.S. administration had focused more on renewables. There was a dialogue with India, but fossil fuels were somewhat pushed to the side. So I'm very excited that we're back in business again with the U.S. and India, and these are commodities that move in large volumes at reasonably good prices. So they put an immediate dent in any trade deficit, and I think that's what the current president wants to do. He wants to see action items that produce results. And I think the biggest and the quickest way to reduce what is not a significant trade deficit, but a trade deficit, would be for India to increase its purchases of U.S. raw materials and U.S. energy products.
You know, it's interesting that you raised that because just yesterday I was in conversation with Rich McCormick, the Republican lawmaker, and his first line was, my challenge to India is stop buying Russian oil. You cannot be financing the war in Ukraine, stop it now. So when the message is so clear, clearly there is going to be an attempt by the Indian government to increase energy imports from the US, and we are expecting, there are conversations on having long-term LNG contracts, contracts to buy more crude oil from the US. Give us a sense of what's your India business like at the moment, and what kind of uptick are you expecting after the Modi-Trump meeting?
Yes, well, our current business in India is quite minimal because we shifted a lot of our business to Europe following the Russia-Ukraine war. But over the years, we've had substantial volumes of business in India, $300–400 million worth of trade in India, 35 or 40% of our business. And it can quickly go back there again. You know, commodities, whether it's LNG, coal, or other raw materials, they can easily be shifted from one region to another. And I think the issue in India, as you mentioned, they're not only purchasing Russian oil, but they're refining it and sending the gas to the U.S. or to Europe. And we're seeing the same thing with Russian coal. India is a large purchaser of Russian coal. So I think the tolls are there for a deal. I think, I've had the honor of meeting the Prime Minister several times. I'm always impressed with his knowledge of details, and he's well briefed and very knowledgeable about topics at hand. So I think he'll go into the meeting with some ideas, and certainly the president never seems to be short of ideas in a meeting. So I'm quite excited about the opportunity here.
You know, I'm not sure whether we should expect too much from this visit because they're meeting for the first time, and they would be probably spending maybe 4 to 5 hours altogether, and this is probably a day and a half long visit, a very tight working visit. But Mark, do you get a sense that India would like to just make sure that this visit goes off well? There are no reciprocal tariffs immediately, and if there are any reciprocal tariffs, the impact is minimal.
Yeah, frankly, I think that the ambition might be a bit higher than that. Mukesh at the start laid out the priority areas and the room to grow in those areas. I think there will be a lot of focus on trade for a lot of obvious reasons. 4 weeks into the administration, predictably, we've had a lot of action on the trade front. We've had new tariffs applied to China. We've had threats of tariffs against China and, against Canada and Mexico. We now have new tariffs on steel and aluminum. Very familiar territory because we had tariffs on steel and aluminum during the first Trump administration, and now comments from the president on reciprocal tariffs. So it's day to day, it's predictable that it's going to be unpredictable in terms of what to expect on the trade front. That said, though, I do think the time's been right. I've been writing and talking about this forever for the two sides to up their game on trade, to really accomplish something in terms of negotiating a big trade deal. Trade economics, but more specifically trade, has lagged behind other aspects of the relationship, certainly the geostrategic and defense cooperation areas. We started doing that work during the first Trump administration. I was a career trade guy, but I was the first U.S. Negotiator on that trade deal, that GSP deal, that eventually fell apart, but working for Bob Lighthizer at the time. And that was a really interesting moment because for the first time, the two sides really bellied up to the table, got a lot of things out on the table in terms of negotiations, got very close to a trade deal. I think learned a lot in terms of working together bilaterally, and much of my career had been in Geneva and the WTO with India, which was always not good. Bilaterally, the two sides found that they could work together. I am confident that they will come out of this meeting tomorrow with a mutual pledge to launch negotiations on a big trade deal, bigger than the last time. It will be ambitious. The timing is likely to be ambitious. And I just sense that there's a real commitment on both sides. And things are different from the last time around in the sense that it will be a larger group of issues, allows for more trade-offs, more creativity in terms of concessions, more transactional approaches. And as I was noting before, they know each other better now.
They know each other. In fact, just on the day of the union budget, I was speaking to Commerce Minister Schroeter, who negotiated that trade deal with Lighthizer in the first Trump administration, and his word was, we are clearly in favor of having a robust trading partnership with India. They did not give it a name, but he said that it can be a full trade agreement, it can be multiple trading pacts under one umbrella. But Lisa, to get you in at this stage, currently we hear from sources in the government that there could be 11 to 12 sectors where India could consider lowering tariffs or giving more market access to US companies. Eric Garcetti, the outgoing US ambassador to India, he mentioned that the India-US partnership is great. We're a lovely married couple, but we're not really working up to our potential. What would be your expectation from this visit? If we are discussing trade pact, what should there be from your perspective?
Well, I appreciate that. It sounds a little bit like we need marriage counseling at the same time.
That's what trade negotiations are like.
Very much so. And I think it builds on what Ernie was saying too. When we think about those raw material inputs, there are a lot of common interests. There are common agendas both in the US and India right now. When you look at an all-in energy policy, ease of doing business, regulatory simplification, making sure that we're really enabling and encouraging that environment for domestic production. There are a lot of ways that we can approach that together in a way that really focuses, and I know a lot of governments want to talk about sectors, but when we think about supply chains, chemicals are a really good example. You can look at us as a sector, or you can look at us as the necessary input to make just about everything else, coming from those energy resources as feedstock that help us develop the materials that become mattresses or paint or semiconductor chips. So I do think, to the point that Minister Goyal was raising, when we look at some of these areas around even just kickstarting early negotiations around supply chain agreements, it's a great way of addressing our common challenges, and it has to go beyond tariffs. if we have that common conversation around things like sound science, risk-based regulatory procedures, and custom simplifications, so things like quality control orders at the border become an efficient way of managing trade without creating this overly bureaucratic or, quite frankly, just confusing system that can make it that much harder to source those raw material imports into domestic producers in India and the United States. So I think the more we can focus on addressing what are those real commercial common challenges, and that's where we have a huge advantage between the
What's the biggest pain point for you in India?
So right now, a lot of it would be some of these import measures that have been implemented against across our industry, particularly because they're just very difficult to manage the process. When we talk about certainty, QCOs are a good example. When they're announced, but then the implementation is in 90 days, or delayed, or postponed. When you have things on the water, it becomes very difficult to manage that process. And not knowing exactly what are consistent application of standards, what are the requirements we need to meet. We are happy to work within a heavily regulated system, but you need the certainty. And that's what's challenging, especially when you're just looking to meet your customers' expectations, including more innovative products that allow them to build that next generation of how they're leading markets.
That's very important because as you speak about the chemical industry or be it the energy industry, all these contracts that we speak about, these are long-term supply chain contracts which have been probably signed 1 year in advance or 2 years in advance. So to change things around within 90 days or 45-day period becomes very difficult. Ernie, I know you wanted to come in. Give us your
I was just going to say, India has a history of having free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements. They have one with Australia, they have one with Indonesia. They cover energy sectors, national resource projects. There's nothing that would prohibit them from following that same process with the U.S. And I think that's what the current administration wants. It wants to sit down with a partner and make a deal. And I was just going to say, I think if you look at what this administration's done in the last 3 weeks, I don't think anyone could say that expectations could ever be too high because they surprise us every day with, kicking it up another level. So I would say that the sky's the limit on what could happen here for the next day.
Again, speaking about what Republican lawmakers have been saying, they're saying that what India should do is reduce tariffs in all areas which are critical for the US from a supply chain perspective, but China has the competitive advantage. How can India go about that? And give us maybe the top 3 or 4 sectors or top 3 or 4 pain points from your perspective.
So to give you an example, India has a 2.75% tariff on US coal. That doesn't apply to Australia or Indonesia because they have a free trade agreement. That's low-hanging fruit to have an immediate deliverable without any real cost to India. I think there are issues, taxation issues that need to be addressed. And then I think in the energy space, especially in the gas space, it's infrastructure, pipelines. How can the U.S. help India develop an infrastructure network to take advantage of additional supplies of LNG? Because as all of us, there's a view that the fossil fuel industry is against making the world clean and against climate change. Nothing could be further from the truth. We all live and breathe the same air. But I think there's a lot that India can gain from a technology standpoint from private companies and U.S. technology companies to help them make this energy transition to what may be a reduced emissions environment rather than trying to just have a radical change that is very costly to the Indian economy.
Right.
Just to add to that really quick, and I think what you're hearing too is that there's a real common sense across the industry as to what those opportunities might be. If we instead look at them as opportunities instead of pain points, we can identify exactly where some of those commercial constraints that are prohibiting us from doing more with each other, whether it's across certain supply chains in the energy industry, chemical industry, downstream producers. That's the benefit of an organization like USISPF. I mean, it brings together that common business community to put together what some of those early wins might be. And I think that's an advantage both of our governments need to think about. What can industry bring to the table that are quick wins, early opportunities to address these challenges, and do more with trading partners we already have so much investment in trade with?
Right. So Mark, what do you think will be the ambition this time? A full FTA, and FTA negotiations can take years. Europe was almost, with Europe we had negotiations for 15 years, they fell through. We're now having negotiations. We had a quick deal with UAE, with Australia, but do you think the ambition is for a full free trade agreement or a limited trade deal right now?
I think it, well, one, I think it will be big, huge.
Trump likes it.
You know, what it's called, yes, absolutely. What it's called probably doesn't matter that much. You know, if it's a free, and I wouldn't rule out a free trade agreement. A free trade agreement is complicated because that brings in the Congress in terms of having legislative authority to negotiate free trade agreements and then to give the Congress the opportunity to vote on it, yes or no. There was a deal done in the first Trump administration, which was a bit like an FTA, but it was called simply the U.S.-Japan Trade Agreement. It included tariff cuts on both sides, which normally in the WTO trade rules only are allowed for FTAs, but the Trump administration you know, broke some glass and did things differently. And negotiated something that allowed for preferential tariffs between them. So I could imagine a scenario in which they launch negotiations. They don't say it's an FTA, but tariffs are very much on the table and involving multiple sectors and certainly going up beyond tariffs, as Lisa was pointing out. But Ernie made a really important point. There was a period in which all market access negotiations, for the most part, lowering tariffs, was done in the GATT and then the WTO. Those days are long gone. And we have now a reality that's been in place for some time in which countries negotiate bilaterally or regionally to lower tariffs. And as a consequence, there are lower preferential tariffs among those trading partners. It's always been difficult in the U.S. to negotiate those kinds of trade agreements. But the last administration, which did some good things with India, had some limited successes, but it made clear it was not negotiating on tariffs. Market access was off the table, and as a consequence, the playing field became less level for U.S. exporters. As Australia and India got together, or UAE, or the EFTA countries, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, as they negotiated with India and got lower tariffs, then there was more of a differential between what the U.S. had in the Indian market and what those countries have. So that's got to be critical, is to negotiate our own deal to lower tariffs. But it's got to go beyond that. It's got to be the non-tariff barriers, the QCOs and many other things that are on the table. It's got to extend to services. And that was not part of last.
When you speak about services, what the Indian government has been saying, and they have conveyed this very clearly to the Trump administration, is that we will take back illegal Indians staying illegally in America, but at the same time, we support having more avenues for legal migration. Could that figure in the trade agreement in any form? And if India wants our deported Indians to be treated better, do you think the Trump administration will seek something in return?
Well, I venture into immigration issues very cautiously for a lot of good reasons, but it's hard to say whether they might be part of a trade agreement. I think they will be part of a trade negotiation because I'm reasonably confident that the Indian side will bring these issues to the table and want to discuss them, and will want to explore what can be done in this area, whether it's raising numbers or making the process less challenging, less administratively burdensome. I can see going down that path, but I'm confident that India will raise those, and I'm confident because last time when I was negotiating with India, India was raising those issues, and we had discussions, and we had follow-up. We'll see. A negotiation is going to be really, really hard. I've been an optimist. I see this very much as a bull market on trade between the United States and India, negotiating a trade agreement. But I don't want to pretend that it won't be hard. It will be very difficult. There will be drama. There will certainly be threats of tariffs. There may be actual new tariffs. There will be disruptions. But I think the two sides, but that's common in trade negotiations. But I think there really will be determination on both sides, and particularly at the leaders level. Having the leaders directly involved and pushing the negotiators really makes the difference. So, I'm confident it can get done.
Right. Lisa, my next question to you would be about China. US companies have been delinking from China, but it's taking time. And many organizations have said that it's going to take years, maybe 10 to 15 years to delink to the extent that Donald Trump wants. But if India wants to rise up to the China plus one opportunity, what more does it need to do right now?
Well, I think in building, this builds on what Mark was talking about. If it's not a full FTA agreement, if we think about things like critical supply chains, and India was really constructive in those negotiations, even under IPAF for the last couple of years. But how do we actually operationalize that? And that's one of the challenges we've seen with a lot of governments. There's very much a focus on the end product, but supply chains, that's a lot of production across that, starting from the energy resources through chemical products. So you can't just have lithium and make a battery. There's a lot of components that go to that. And that's one of the areas of opportunity. If you start maybe building block agreements around those, identify what are those materials, whether it's semiconductor chips, pharmaceuticals, construction materials. What are the industries that's in our mutual interest to be growing? How do I identify what are the components, critical components of those supply chains, and then focus on those areas of commercial opportunity, our common interest in that ease of doing business, to identify those specific areas of this is what slows those investments down. This is how we source more to each other. How are we looking at this from how do we advantage rather than restrict? That's a great way. We would see that as a great path forward of demonstrating how we're each other's trusted trade partners.
Right. My final set of questions, and Ernie, if I could ask you, we had great and tough trade negotiations last time, but there was no X factor. There is an X factor this time, or the Musk factor. Elon Musk is very much a part of the Trump administration. Nobody knows how long, but currently he's got Donald Trump's ear. He is his advisor. He's heading the Department of Government Efficiency. What's going to be his influence on any trade talks with India?
Well, first of all, I have a bias to the X factor
Okay.
from Xcoal. But I think it's an outside set of eyes, an objective set of eyes. I think it will find its walls because eventually you can only break glass so long and then you start hitting concrete. So I don't know where that line is at, but I think for now, I think the administration has taken a view, my personal view, that this is a blank sheet of paper, and let's start from like zero budgeting and figure out what we build up. Again, very hard to change something that has been built over 250 years, 300 years. But I think most people, and especially if you get into the heartland of America, are excited to see this today. Of course, those are the people that were the big supporters to put Donald Trump in the presidency. So I think he's playing to his political strength.
Right. So that would be my final question to you, Mark. When we speak about Musk, he's somebody who has tremendous business interests in China, a huge manufacturing base in China. He's been speaking to the Chinese government to have a greater rollout of autonomous vehicles. Keeping all of that in mind, when you have someone who's got such deep interest in China, how will that impact Trump's policies vis-a-vis India? Could at some point there be a deadlock? Do you think there will be a pushback from Trump's own people when it comes to high tariffs or pushing India on tariffs?
Well, number one on trade, I think the president himself will be the top negotiator on the U.S. side. So, we certainly will, with members of the cabinet directly involved, I do anticipate the U.S. Trade Rep's office, Jameson Greer, will lead those negotiations. And things are beginning to play out that way. In fact,
appointments are also taking place even now.
yeah, and I spent much of my career at USTR, so I'm hugely biased, but USTR, in fact, is one of those agencies that you would think might be a model in terms of what DOGE is looking at, because it's lean and mean, it's very small, it's cabinet level, but you're talking several hundred people in the organization who are coordinating trade policy and conducting trade negotiations. So it kind of fits with what Musk has been doing so far. But Trump cares about trade. Tariffs for decades have been a preoccupation for him. So I think he will lead the negotiation. And he's going back to the last administration, the first Trump administration. He talked about India, and he clearly was an advocate for there being a trade agreement. So I think it will be a hard negotiated, hard fought agreement. At the end of the day, it may be phased. There may be interim agreements over time, but I don't see China as being parallel with India in terms of what may happen on the trade front, and what the limits are in terms of trade negotiations.
All right, so fantastic talking to all of you about the US-India trade partnership, what we can expect over the next few weeks, months, or maybe the next 1 year. But clearly there is a vision that there should be more trade, there should be lower tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers on the Indian side, and more predictability in policy making, and more energy imports from the US as well. Thank you once again to all of you.
Thanks, Parikshit, Mark, Lisa, and Ernie. Is there any Q&A? Please step your panel. Otherwise, we can commence with a small break, and then we will begin our second panel at 2:30 sharp. If there are any Q&A, please.
Let's have a seat.
That is, if there are questions. Just bear in mind, we only have that microphone there, so you'll have to speak up a little bit, but name and affiliation. Any questions, guys?
Ernie, you have to come back.
We must do.
Yeah. Mr. Cunningham.
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, having watched Parikshit for so long on small screens across oceans, such a pleasure to have you here in the snows of Washington and to see you in person.
So glad to see you.
Thank you for being here and joining us. I've been watching this relationship for 15 years or more. And one thing that I've seen change is the increasing importance of the Indian American community here in the United States, especially in the political world. Let's not forget, the elections last November, the Democratic candidate was a woman of Indian American origin. The Republican vice president's candidate's wife was Indian American. You had Indian Americans on both sides of the top of the ticket. It's remarkable. This year, I predict we'll see Indian Americans running for Senate and possibly running for additional seats as governor in the US. This gives India a tailwind that really no other country that Donald Trump might be negotiating with, jousting with, I think he will be, my own assessment, I'm curious what the group thinks, is that as Trump faces off against Modi, he'll be very conscious, how will this play with the Indian American community here in the United States, who are up for grabs. They're Republicans, they're Democrats, they really straddle the aisle quite nicely. I think he'll be very interested in how does he cause this relationship to strengthen his political bonds with the Indian American community. I just wonder if any of you see that as being a useful backdrop for trade and other negotiations with India.
It's an important point because one, it's a big vote bank, and secondly, a big tax-paying community as well. Mark, would you like to take that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and one I hadn't thought about in depth in terms of a factor, but it makes a lot of sense. And certainly what I've seen in the first Trump administration and this time so far is that the president seems likely to want to approach India in terms of reaching an agreement and it being mutually beneficial and it not simply being about taking aggressive action and not really being interested in doing a trade deal. So it might contrast with Europeans, for example, or maybe even Canada. It's been kind of remarkable to try to assess that dynamic where, I mean, sometimes it seems like it's mostly about raising the tariffs as opposed to leveraging them. And I do feel that the approach with India is certainly threatening tariffs, but very much leveraging them and the objective being a trade agreement that should sell well on both sides. And it's clear, I mean, you referenced Mr. Goyal before, and he's been talking about a big trade deal since the first Trump administration. He tried during the Biden administration. The Biden administration just was not doing those big trade deals. So I think there's a very willing partner. I mean, frankly, I think the two are very willing partners. And, the issue you raised in terms of what we've seen with the Indian American population in this country, which has grown so much, has created so much vibrancy. And in fact, I spent a career at USISPF, but over the years I found that so many of my colleagues, mostly American-born, were of Indian Asian descent. At the table with me, with India being on the other side. So it's a fascinating dynamic.
Right. Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah. So I'm Sahil, co-founder and CEO of T2, based in Bay Area. How is your view on the nuclear power plants being now opened up in India? And because initially when India became nuclear power, the US was not viewing it in a classic way. But now the way it is opening up for the private sector and for energy consumption increasing high in India. What's your view on those sides?
Who would like to take that?
I think nuclear power is a cornerstone of the transition to whatever the new energy future may be. And I think the U.S. has great technology, other countries have great technology. But I think it's a tremendous opportunity as part of a trade agreement for U.S. nuclear technology for nuclear power in India. And people talk about zero carbon forms of energy. We've had nuclear power since 1945, and I think it's one of the, it should be the cornerstone of an energy program. So I'd be very excited about something happening.
Very interesting that you raised that because we just signed a declaration of intent with the French government to have a partnership on small modular reactors. Do you hope that could also figure in any kind of trade agreement between US and India as well?
Absolutely. I think, again, if you look at the three big builders of nuclear power, probably four, US, Korea, France, and China. but the technology's here. It was developed here 60 years ago. So I think we as Americans are missing an opportunity by not promoting it.
Well, and actually on that point, as a company that's actually investing in, we're piloting an SMR project down in the Gulf. It's a great example to combine both questions. When you think about that expertise, companies that are actually doing this and applying this to manufacturing so that we can produce less carbon intensive product, that expertise of the investors here and in India, combined with the constituency of Indian Americans here, that is a very strong group to take opportunity in the window that we have now to be proactive about what we want to see in the deals. Our two leaders are going to come away with a great statement from these days and hopefully some really strong commitments. But ultimately, that's a framework for us to take advantage of operating in. Bring these concrete ideas to the table in a way that says, here's what we can get done and here's where you're going to see results. And I think there's a lot of momentum to make that happen. And that's a way of being not just reacting to all the other announcements that we're seeing, but how do we get proactive about what's an agenda we can all care and benefit from?
Great.
On Lisa's point, on the joint statement, what we expect as outcomes here.
Yeah.
I read through the U.S.-Japan joint statement associated with Prime Minister's visit, and I was surprised at how lacking it was on specifics and real commitments. I think this joint statement, the Prime Minister Modi's and President Trump's joint statement, is going to be much meatier. I mean, there will be real substance and real commitments and a real plan going forward.
Right. And he is a president who likes concrete outcomes whenever he has any kind of dealing or bilateral talks with the MP. But Nan here wants to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Nayan. I'm with Voice of America. I'm also an editor for the Wilson Center. And I write about critical minerals diversification efforts, a topic which I have not covered. Do you think, given this administration's priorities on national security more than climate, and India had recently signed an MOU with the Biden administration, the previous one, on diversification of critical minerals. India is not a big player in it, but there's a lot of potential in rare earths and other sectors. Do you think the Indian side and even others in the space like Australia or Japan should try and reframe this not from a climate or an energy transition perspective to the more national security, because it has defense applications, the issue of critical minerals. So do you think there is a need to reframe that, which the administration would be more willing to listen to and collaborate with going forward?
I don't think it has to be either or. I think it can be both. And critical minerals cross a spectrum of sectors, not just national security and climate. But I think the one thing you find in the world is rare earths are not that rare. The problem is processing them and getting them into a final state for use. And I wouldn't rule out what India may have. I think there's a lot of testing and exploration in India that's hasn't really defined all the natural resources India has. It's a country that's blessed with a tremendous amount of natural resources. You may find some of those critical minerals or rare earths there. So I would say both. I don't think you have to make an either or decision.
But yeah, it could be clearly a part, and it has been a talk of on supply chain partnership and critical minerals. We've been having that conversation with the Biden administration, which was also there under ISET. Do you expect this to be a part of the trade agreement as well?
I don't know that it matters. I expect it will be a priority area for both sides. It probably will be reframed in some ways, but I think Ernie's point is it could be either. It doesn't really. I mean, it's important. It's critical. Whether it happens on the trade side or whether it happens more on the defense cooperation side, whether it's NSC versus USTR, it doesn't really matter necessarily. It will be different though, because in the Biden administration, there's so much focus on the legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's what India really wanted, rather than an MOU with the Commerce Department that was all about working together. It was having access to this market and the domestic content requirements associated with IRA. Now that's well, it's hard to know what happens next with that. So, you know, I'm sure there will be different approaches, but it will be a priority area for both sides, whether it's through a trade negotiation or through other aspects of the relationship.
Right. Lisa, as Ernie was also pointing out, China does not dominate the world's lithium reserves, but the majority of the refining of lithium happens in China. What can India do to rise up to that challenge, and how can US and India have a closer supply chain partnership of critical minerals?
Well, I think that's a great example, and I fully agree with what Ernie was saying. It's an all-in. And when we think about that processing, again, mutual interest, both governments want to grow more economic activity. Sharing that technology, creating the opportunities where we're not just exploring, extracting, and mining, but going all the way through to processing and then creating the value chains that go along with. And that's how you get into that broader, it's not its own separate activity. Critical minerals is an essential component of sourcing these supply chains. So the more we can combine that story and look at it from that aspect of how are we growing the economic value chain and securing all those other benefits, whether it's the defense-related, national security, environmental. You could say the same thing about so many different value chains. We focus a lot on waste management, addressing some of the plastic challenges that are out there on the planet. Waste management is an economic model. The more we're investing in recycling, the more we're looking at that material now not as a waste, but as a feedstock. It's how we can create out of this. And I think you can look at so many different value chains the same way.
All right. Finally, any more questions, and then maybe we can wrap up the panel.
Parikshit, question more for Ernie. I think the Ukraine war showed that energy security is impaired. And India has abundance of coal and will keep on using that. So from your perspective, what can we do that while energy security is there, we also deal with the environment issues?
So, Mukesh, I think, first of all, I have to give a lot of credit to the current Indian government. They have significantly improved the efficiency, the safety, and the environmental standards of their coal mines and coal production. And they're reaping the benefits of that in additional forms of low-cost energy. But the technology is there. And I think you have to separate. I think people have lost the view that there's a line between pollution and carbon. Most people don't see that line anymore. The technology is there to solve pollution today. It's a multi-decades technology. It's proven and cost-effective and reliable. And now we're evolving into how do we solve the carbon problem. And I think what people are missing, and I think India is a good testing ground for this, is I think there's a mitigation effect that could come into play rather than an elimination effect. So India is a prime area for coal gasification. The Prime Minister has talked about that because of the resources it has. There'd be a significant reduction in India's carbon emissions just by gasifying the coal it has. That technology exists today. So again, as I mentioned, it's not only supplying energy to India, but there's a lot of private partnerships that could evolve to apply lower carbon emission technologies to India to allow India needs reliable, competitive sources of energy to grow. And I think over the last few years, people have lost sight of that, and now it's kind of pulling back to find a middle ground that's acceptable to everybody.
One more.
All right.
More questions.
Yeah, more questions coming in.
Hi, Jake and Sarah. How do we reconcile India's objective to ensure a multilateral global reality as opposed to President Trump's reality that, America is the epicenter of geopolitics? Who do we balance towards, and who do we ensure ultimately comes out as the victor in this debate?
You want to take that?
Well, as a trade guy, when you speak of multilateral, that's WTO, the World Trade Organization. I don't see any, certainly of major trading countries, a real impetus or, policy priority to go back to a strong WTO. I don't see that with India. There may be rhetoric, but, as again, I negotiated a lot with India and Geneva, the integrity of the system was not necessarily kind of the top goal. Now that WTO, I just wrote this yesterday for the Hindra Foundation. WTO is pretty irrelevant in this space. And the US contributed to that, India contributed to that, China contributed to that, many countries. It's not, it wasn't just a US phenomenon. Again, in the trade sphere, I just don't see that being a question of victors and whose vision plays out, because I think the vision of almost everyone these days is we're going bilaterally, we're going regionally, we're not going to Geneva to solve these problems.
Khushbu also had a question.
I just, if I remember correctly, I think in the beginning we heard something on the lines that there was some anxiety in India over President Trump signing a big grand deal that we have been talking about over months now with China, and then Indian interests being sidelined. During this visit, do you think there could be some sort of, Prime Minister Modi seeking some reassurances? We've been waiting for President Trump to talk to President Xi since last week, and that phone call did happen, as we all know, despite being announced. What kind of reassurances do you think that India is seeking in terms of, President Trump not signing this grand deal with China that in a way sidelines India's interests or hurts India's interests in some way, specifically when it comes to the trade issue and the border dispute that India has with China? We have seen some intelligence being, given to India on that clashes that happen after that as well. So I just want to get a sense from you on the kind of reassurances and what, from what prism do Trump 2.0 really see India when it comes to competing with China, tackling China in the region, but also when it comes to trade, there could be a grand deal. China is the second largest importer of pork and beef. So India is not, it's an exporter. So how do you see those, those balances coming into this visit? I'm very curious about that. Thank you.
I'll just make one comment, and it might surprise people. India is a democracy, China's an autocracy. I think Modi has the ability to move quicker than Xi does, even though you would think the opposite. So, I lived, almost minute by minute the last U.S.-China trade dispute, and it lasted almost 2 years, like 20 months. Well, I don't think, there may be a grand deal coming, but I don't think it's coming quickly. And Ron probably knows, were there 12 or 13 meetings or dialogues between the two trade groups to get to what became the Phase 1 trade group? So I think Prime Minister Modi has more room to move quicker than President Xi has. And that would be, I think, counterintuitive to the two forms of government. But I think Xi has more internal forces to consider than Modi has.
I would agree. I think there's a greater likelihood of the U.S. doing a trade agreement with India that sidelines China than the reverse. And in terms of reassurances, I expect it's more reassurances about tariffs being applied to India, particularly if it's a reciprocal tariff approach. But, just in the broadest of terms, my sense is the Trump administration is a bit more focused with China on decoupling, more decoupling. With India, it's becoming closer and integrating the economies more. So that's my take.
Right. A point that Mukesh had made a little while back, that Donald Trump is going to seek a deal with India that he can use for bargaining with China. Would that be your concern as well?
It hasn't been. So No, I think negotiating with India on a trade deal is for the sake of a closer relationship with India. And, I mean, there can be some China dynamics, but I think it's centrally the importance to both sides of becoming closer. So, and I would predict these new tariffs that have been applied to China remain in place for quite some time. And there's even a likelihood that more tariffs will follow against China.
Right. So, thank you so much, Ernie, Lisa, and Mark, for that conversation, and the audience for those brilliant, brilliant questions. Those were some issues that we didn't touch upon in our panel discussions, and it was great to talk about that as well. So, thank you everyone in the audience, and thanks to our wonderful panel as well.